So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm extremely happy and honored to be here today to speak about Two-Spirit data collection and how we can work together to challenge the history of erasure. So the main goal of this presentation is truly some self-reflection. So as much as I would love to be able to run down and burn the system down, unfortunately, we know that that's not completely possible. And I truly believe that through having some of these conversations, or many of these conversations, we're able to start to reflect on our own practices and our own ways of being. And through that reflection and that change, we can hopefully challenge some of the current harmful practices in place. So first, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm calling in on the unceded territory of Coast Salish people, which lies within the nations of the Ketsi, Semiahmoo, and Kwantlen First Nations, so which we now know as South Surrey. I always ensure that I include a land acknowledgement because through the teachings that I've been gifted, it is really that moment of recognition to where we've come from, where we are today, and how we have responsibility with education. So I'll speak to that in a moment, but just really that moment of connecting back to our seats, where we're at, where we're sitting or standing, and that reflection piece. So just a quick agenda. Who am I? The concept of decolonization, the concept of the binary, the concept of two-spirit. So really diving into some of those conceptual understandings of those three pieces, and hopefully wrapping them all up together to in the end challenge the current state of erasure, and through two-spirit histories and teachings, we can hopefully find some pathways to do that within our areas of research. So as Brittany said, who am I? I am very proudly Two-Spirit and Métis. My family is originally from Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territory. And I'm actually Métis through both my parents, but a member of Métis Nation BC through my mom's lineage. So Treaty 1 and Treaty 2 territories, which we now know as Winnipeg and St. Rose-du-lac, both in Manitoba. But I was born and raised on Coast Salish territory, moved around a fair bit within the Solo Nation, as well as in Katsi, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo, and lived in Vancouver for a little bit, or among the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I'm very thankful to be here today. I also always make sure I note that I am also on the path of reclaiming my own ancestry and identity and indigeneity. So as a Métis person, I was raised in the realms of Métis teachings, but not to the degree as a lot were lost through Métis communities as well in Manitoba, but throughout the prairies. So as I am doing this work and presenting on this topic, I am also a student and very much on the path of reclaiming my ancestry and my identity, or my conceptual understanding as a two-spirit person. So expectations, I just always make sure that I make a slide about zero tolerance for harmful language. So I do believe in more of a roundtable presentation. So if folks have questions, they can pop them in the chat throughout, and either Brittany or will interrupt me during that part of the presentation if it's relevant, and I'm more than happy to answer that, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and not getting you to wait till the end. But they must be asked in a respectful manner. So ensuring that proper pronoun usage, proper language, and not causing any harm or any stigmatizing language is used within the chat. So quickly, the concept of decolonization. So I'm sure many folks have heard this term or are aware of this term, but I really think through this presentation, and also through the whole process of two-spirit history, or the refinding of two-spirit histories and teachings, we're practicing decolonization, but also I really like to highlight what we think it is, what we see it currently as, and what it hopes to be, or what it should be, in my opinion. So what do we mean when we say decolonization? So decolonization is about shifting the way Indigenous people view themselves and the way non-Indigenous people view Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are reclaiming the family, community, culture, language, history, and traditions that were taken under the federal government policies designed for assimilation. Decolonization restores Indigenous worldviews. It restores culture and traditional ways. And decolonization replaces Western interpretations of history with Indigenous perspectives of history. And this is extremely relevant in this conversation when we're talking about the greater LGBTQ community and the incorporation or erasure of two-spirit folks within that acronym and within current state of research. So I think one of the pieces to really hold on to is that decolonization replaces Western interpretations. And I'll get into that in a minute. So within healthcare, within the realms that I work and survive in, what do we mean when we say decolonization? A big spot is, and a big conversation we have is about creating space. But through the decolonial perspective, are we creating space or are we giving space back? So there is many places and spaces for Two-Spirit folks, queer and trans Indigenous folks before that were taken away and stripped away through assimilation and colonization. So are we creating space? No, we're giving back the space. And that simple perspective change is extremely important when we talk about equality and equity. Increasing visibility or invisibility, sorry, maybe a Freudian slip there, but what does that actually look like in decolonization? Is it a plaque on the wall, a mural painted, a totem pole in front of a hospital? What does it actually look like? And I think that's a huge point for us to reflect on in the areas that we work in when we do see Indigenous art or Indigenous perspectives in places, and how are they actually incorporated in our areas of work? Is it just a beautiful mural, or are we actually incorporating it in everything we do to challenge the current state of racism and discrimination that Indigenous folks face within our province and within Turtle Island? And unfortunately, we still have a very long way to go. We know through the many reports that are coming out. In Plain Sight is a perfect example, which I'll speak to in a little bit as well. But we do have a very long way to go within healthcare and especially within research and academia, which I'll dive into. Next, a concept that they all kind of seem, to some folks, maybe not to all the folks on the call, they kind of seem random, but they're all very, very much intertwined. So the next is the concept of the binary. So through the decolonial lens, it really, we should be applying it to the binary and unpacking and dissecting the Western approach of the binary. So another term that many of us hear quite often is the binary. What does the binary mean, and what does it mean within your realm or your worlds that you work and live in, as well as what does it mean overall? So simply put, the binary, as Webster's dictionary defines it, is consisting of, indicating, or involving two. So in current date society, the binary currently really centers around all human beings as either a man or a woman. And I think this is an extremely important aspect when we're speaking about queer health, Two-Spirit health, queer and trans Indigenous health factors, is this forced binary on people. So the binary is a Western construct that is extremely limiting and purposely used to divide and disempower folks who live outside of this societal norm. So it's extremely important that we know that throughout Turtle Island and the entire world, there are many, many communities with multiple genders and gender expressions and gender identities. The binary was created purposely to divide, disempower folks who do not fit within the societal mold. And I think it's extremely important for us to start to break down some of those assumptions that we make when we see folks, some of the assumptions that we make within society. And I think one of the most important pieces for us to remember is it's not necessarily our fault that we make assumptions about people's gender or people's sexual orientation because of societal influence, but it is our responsibility now to challenge those thoughts and those assumptions, challenging assumptions that when we walk into a room or into a research study section area that we're assuming people's pronouns and genders, and we should be having those conversations. And in many Indigenous languages and cultures throughout Turtle Island, gendered language actually doesn't exist. And in reality, many languages that folks speak around the world work more on the responsibility of the person instead of what is between instead of the genders or who we're having sex with. It's this interesting focus within Western concepts or Western society that we really like to focus on people's genitals as well as who we're having sex with instead of their roles and responsibilities in community, which is what I'll really expand on within the concept of being Two-Spirit. We must challenge both the internal and systemic binaries that are forced upon many of our processes, especially within research, especially within our healthcare system. In the worlds of birthing, which I do a lot of my work within, it's an extremely genderized area of practice, and we must break down and work through many of the forced binaries that are currently in place to ensure that we create an environment that is welcoming to all folks who give birth, but all folks within our healthcare system. Next, the concept of Two-Spirit. So this is the section that I'm hoping we'll get into the meat and potatoes of this conversation and wrap together many pieces. So historically, before we move on, I also must mention the gift of education and the responsibility that comes with this. So another decolonial or perspective that needs decolonizing perspective that we need to challenge is that in Western ways of education, we're taught that once we hear something and learn it, that it's now ours and that we can share it freely as our own. And this isn't the case. So as I spoke earlier in my land acknowledgement, the teachings that I was gifted, these slides especially are teachings that I've been gifted. So we don't just get to copy and paste and replicate and share outside of these realms without that conversation and that acknowledgement and responsibility of education. So it is extremely important for me to share that my great friend and mentor, Harlan Pruden, who has laid the pathway in many, many realms for Two-Spirit health research, Two-Spirit academia. For me in this role in itself was led by Harlan. So really acknowledging that his advocacy and the work that he's done and the gifting of some of this knowledge to me that he's been able to share that I'm able to present with you today. So Two-Spirit is a community organizing tool and not necessarily an identity or an individualistic characterization. So we need to understand that it is difficult to make sense of this concept outside an Indigenous framework, but traditionally it was more about a gender analysis, not a sexual orientation. It was more about your responsibilities in community than who you were having sex with or your genitals. So it was more about your role as a matchmaker or your role as a ceremony holder in community. And that's what was more of the gendered analysis, which included multiple forms of gender. So 5, 6, 7, 8, up to 9 genders in some of the communities throughout Turtle Island. And that it's not just one thing. And this is the conversation between individual characteristics and the concept. So Two-Spirit conceptual understanding or Two-Spirit identity is not just one thing, but it is all encompassing. So it includes sexual orientation, it includes gender, it includes many different roles, advocacy. If you especially within the Two-Spirit community, you really see a number of Two-Spirit folks as advocates because that is a part of our gifts within the Two-Spirit realms. Today, most people do associate Two-Spirit within the LGBTQ AI community, but as I've been stating, it's not just one piece. Historically, we were absorbed or connected, I think strongly due to a safety aspect, but now we've learned that through that continuous inclusion in the acronym, it has erased specific Indigenous experiences. So current data collection of gender, sexual orientation. So I'm going to get into this in a little bit about how historically and for a long time, Two-Spirit has either been bumped into a gender category or a sexual orientation category, and through some methods that Harlan and Travis Solway have been able to work on, a safer way for us to collect that data in a more holistic way instead of bumping it into a single or individual characteristic, which includes indigeneity. Brittany, I'll just stop for a minute. Is there any questions on this piece? No? Okay.
No questions yet, Jessy.
Thank you. So historically, before contact, there were many terms for Two-Spirit folks. So Two-Spirit, the term or the name is more of a holding place, as historically we utilized, or there was utilization of multiple terms. And through a lot of advocacy and through a Two-Spirit archive that's being created in Manitoba, we've been able to find actually hundreds of terms that are community specific for or related to the Two-Spirit concept. So historically, before contact, there were many forms or many terms used for Two-Spirit people. In the late 1400s to the early 90s, there was a term berdache that was used to explain Two-Spirit people, which is an extremely harmful and discriminatory term. And I mentioned here today just to realize that and to bring to light the long-term damage that has resulted for Two-Spirit people through the use of language that was stigmatizing and shameful. And then in the 90s, through a beautiful gathering in Manitoba, actually, the term Two-Spirit was coined through a national gathering, and it came to be through the vision of Elder Myra, who shares widely about their understanding and their dream about Two-Spirit people. And it's a beautiful holding place, or a beautiful term to hold until we are able to identify our own words within our own communities, which we're on the path of reclaiming as we speak. So historically within community, Two-Spirit people had many roles, which included mediators, matchmakers, social workers, name givers, Sundance, were holy people, puberty ceremonies, peacemakers for community. So it was really about these roles in community that analyzed your place within more of that gender analysis that I spoke about earlier about gendered pieces. So it was more about these roles than about who you were having sex with, which was extremely important for us to realize that it is about responsibilities of people versus our genitals and who we're having sex with. And I keep repeating that. So it is an extremely beautiful piece. And this is where I like to really share my connection to realization and deeper understanding of cultural healing is that I was able to meet a Métis elder a couple years, or well, actually 15 years ago, or over 15 years ago now. And that was the first time I connected with a Métis elder who spoke about Two-Spirit people and the roles and responsibilities of Two-Spirit people in community. And that was the first time I truly felt how healing or connecting to something that I didn't even know was missing could be, and how healing culture could be. And from that moment on, I went straight down the path of working within and for the Two-Spirit community. So through that teaching and that understanding and that weight being lifted off my shoulders, that historically I was accepted in community, and historically Two-Spirit people were not seen as abnormal or wrong. And historically that Two-Spirit people had roles and responsibilities in community that were prided on. So really that understanding that through colonization and assimilation, we lost a lot of that. Not to say that everything was perfect. I don't wear rose-colored glasses. I understand that there was likely forms of discrimination historically, but overall, through the many teachings that have been gifted and rediscovered about Two-Spirit people, overall, there was a mass understanding and acceptance of Two-Spirit people in community, which is unfortunately we have lost. And I think a conversation that does come up often is Two-Spirit an Indigenous specific term? And I just always like to clarify that yes, Two-Spirit is an Indigenous specific term, though the term is Indigenous specific within within Turtle Island. The concept in itself is not specific to the Indigenous people of Turtle Island. It's actually very common throughout the world, is the understandings of multiple gender forms or gender analysis within communities. And many countries throughout the world have not just the binary forced genders, but have multiple forms of gender, which I think is a beautiful thing for us to realize that colonization did bring in a lot of damage in the many realms of racism, discrimination, and homophobia. I will note that on the next slide, I will be speaking to residential schools. So folks who are on the call, I do like to just state that if you would like to turn off your speaker for a moment, if you would like, or just because I will be speaking for a moment about residential schools. So just give me a moment. So this image is again an image that was gifted to me through a Two-Spirit presentation that Harlan and I do, that many or some of you may have seen. And this slide, I think, is one of them, is an extremely important slide for us to see, to bring visibility to the thousands of children, thousands and thousands of children that we know that we have lost and through the residential school system, and link it back to the Two-Spirit community as well. So within this image, it has everything to do with Two-Spirit people and nothing to do with Two-Spirit people. And I think that realization is that it has nothing to do with Two-Spirit people, because if you look, the binary is forced upon these children. It was forced upon children, Indigenous children, throughout colonization in the residential school system. So that's why it has nothing to do with Two-Spirit people, but it also has everything to do with Two-Spirit people, because we were there, we are in this picture. And it's that realization that forced assimilation also was that forced binary among our Indigenous children that were forced into residential school. So this form of discrimination and erasure is deeply rooted in colonization and assimilation. And I think it's extremely important for us to continue to unpack these pieces of discrimination that happens towards folks because of this forced binary. I also will just hold space for a quick moment for the continuous findings and the over 10,000 findings that we found so far, and the more that we continue to find of our lost and stolen children. So just in space. Thank you. So throughout the presentation so far, I've kind of tried to map up decolonization, the binary and two-spirit folks to get us to where we are now, to the current state of erasure of two-spirit people. So we've seen this mass resurgence of two-spirit folks, especially the last couple of years, but I've found this current and continuous state of erasure. So I spoke earlier that the absorption of two-spirit folks. So many two-spirit folks have been absorbed into the LGBTQ acronym and collapsed with other Western gender and sexual minority populations for the purpose of analysis. So I think this is a huge piece when we're talking about research, that this may have been done to protect against the threat of identification when samples of two-spirit people are deemed too small. But it is important that and that this decision reinforces the problematic practice of equating two-spirit people with Western identities. So when we are continuously absorbing two-spirit folks within that LGBTQ acronym, we are continuously to assume that two-spirit folks are within the are equal to the Western constructs of the LGBTQ community. So further, this results in a complete erasure of two-spirit unique experiences and the complex, beautiful intersectionalities of indigeneity and two-spirit folks and queer and indigiqueer and trans Indigenous folks. Because we're absorbed into this mass LGBTQ spectrum instead of being reported out with our beautiful, unique avenues. I think we must also ask ourselves when we're thinking about this absorption is the types of research questions we're asking and how they're being formed. So it's interesting. I noted this, I really started to notice this within my master's work a couple of years ago, but really that continuous absorption or that inclusion of two-spirit folks within the research question or within the title. But once you actually start getting into the data and into the analysis, two-spirit folks are typically either not reported on, or if they are, the groups were deemed too small and it was at risk of confidentiality or at risks of unsafety or risks of safety for two-spirit folks. So then continuously left out, but yet are still mentioned in the titles or within the research questions. So it creates this false data source or these false data hub that actually isn't there once you actually dive into the research. And that's been going on for an unfortunate amount of time. If you look back through some of the articles and the pieces of this continuous erasure, and now we're utilizing the term two-spirit, but not actually giving the data for it. And part of that is done through confidentiality, which I truly believe through our current state of confidentiality and the forms of confidentiality is a tool of colonization, because we focus on numbers, we focus on stats. And through this, we believe that if the numbers are too small, there's a potential risk of a breach of confidentiality, and thus we can include them or we absorb them. So our numbers are too small, are currently so small because of the system. So our system has created us and limited us and erased us to such a small number that we then are further erased because of limitations of confidentiality or majority view. So current state of research also has a statistical focus, or data collection has this majority view and the mean view. But through that perspective, again, two-spirit folks are typically outside of that average or that mean, which I don't know actually what that means, but within that average, and we are left out again. So it's this continual understanding that through these forms of data collection and safety, we're erasing two-spirit folks because we are smaller groups of people as a result of the system, but then left out further because we're a smaller group of people. And it's this continuous cycle. And a perfect example of that, I think, is within our current, and not to call it out, but to call it out is the current documentation that we have within the In Plain Sight. So through In Plain Sight, a document that validated a lot of extremely harmful experiences throughout the province of BC, also completely erased two-spirit people. So I was a part of a pretty big campaign when they were first doing data collection for the In Plain Sight report for two-spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous folks to submit their perspectives, and advocated to ensure that our experiences and our complex, beautiful, intersecting experiences of gender expression and indigeneity and sexual orientation and all those pieces were included in that, because we do know that between 70 and 80% of queer folks who access healthcare do experience discriminations or assumptions in care. And we do know that an extremely high percentage of Indigenous people who access healthcare experience similar rates of discrimination. So when we combine them both, we can expect that those rates would be astronomically high. So through this recruitment, we were extremely excited to be able to have some of this documentation. And unfortunately, through the process of data collection and data analysis, Two-Spirit people were left out because our number, though it was almost 300 people, which is a beautifully high number, to the data analysis team was deemed not high enough. It was actually on almost 9% respondent rate, which we account for about 0.2% of the population. So a 9% was actually a beautifully high and overrepresentation of Two-Spirit folks. But because of the current practices, it was deemed as too small, or deemed as there was a breach or a risk of confidentiality, as well as the numbers were too small. So it's a perfect example of how Two-Spirit folks are erased from extremely important documents and extremely important tools. And it's done not necessarily purposefully, but through these tools. Is it purposely? I don't like, I think that's a piece that I'm hoping that we can reflect on after today. And I'm always happy to have further conversations after today, but it is these perspectives of the average, instead of how come we are still looking so much at this center group instead of the folks who end up on either side? Why are we continuing to focus on the norm when we know folks on either side of that so-called norm are the folks who we need to be focusing on providing resources and creating culturally tailored resources for? So it's this understanding, and I think this new shift that we're starting to see a little bit within research, but this new shift away from focusing on bigger groups of people and starting to look at smaller community groups that have specific and beautifully multiple intersecting identities and conceptual understandings. So I think it is something for us all to reflect on the current state. I also like to bring in that perspective, especially in the realms of birth work that I experience. A lot of times we are speaking about women within, our folks who identify as women within birth work. So a common question that I do experience is folks being like, well, people who birth who don't identify as women are such a small number that why is this so relevant? And my question is always, well, why isn't it? Why isn't it relevant even for one person? And it's a perspective that majority view matters more than smaller groups of people who are experiencing higher rates of harm. And that's the perspective that we really need to start thinking about. So in the realms of birthing, why wouldn't we want to create an environment where all folks who birth feel safe and able, or feel safer, because I don't know if there's any such thing as a current safe healthcare system, but safer to access services and birth beautifully? Because what is our end goal, especially in birth work, is to create an environment where that new parent and that new babe can bond. And if I'm sitting there because I don't have the appropriate tools to talk about pronouns or body parts, then we are creating a system that's setting up folks to have uncomfortable birthing experiences and overall uncomfortable experiences while accessing healthcare. So we need to start looking at the smaller groups of people, at Two-Spirit folks specifically, and creating culturally tailored resources so that we feel seen and visible and are included in data research, not just in the title, but actually in the documents, actually in the analysis. And if the numbers are small, then we need to create new tools to be able to challenge some of those confidentiality risks and have those conversations with community members to ensure that their experiences are captured appropriately and the contextual factors are captured appropriately. Brittany, any questions yet? Nope, we're good. Keep going.
Keep going, Jessy.
Beautiful. Thank you. This is a slide that I just also want to make sure that I include within some of our work. And I think it's this understanding that, well, if folks haven't heard about the amazing work led by AJ, who's on the call here, and the amazing research toolkits that they've been able to produce, and we're all currently working on is this conceptual understanding of the difference between sex and gender. And within these tools and the realms of research, we must always ask ourselves if and why we're including sex and gender identifiers within our questions or within our research overall. So like I was saying about Two-Spirit folks being included in the research questions, why are we including Two-Spirit people in the specific research questions? Is it relevant? Is it not? If we're investigating testosterone, are we specifically including gender expressions or gender identities within our questions? Do we need to be? Do we need to be including sex identifiers within our questions? So for a long time, we've been very broadly been utilizing sex and gendered language within our research questions, but actually limit or eliminate folks who don't fit within those societal norms or those societal expectations. So we do that a lot within menstruation, we do that a lot within birth, we do that a lot within puberty conversations, we do that a lot within sex conversations, actual sexual health conversations, where we specifically target gender when it's not really relevant. And that results in a complete erasure of two-spirit, queer, trans, and non-binary folks within our data sets and our data collection. Or it actually results in us pigeonholing ourselves to absorb gender or queer, trans, non-binary folks into our spectrums, because we haven't actually asked the question, or we're too specific in our question about genders, and then we typically absorb folks or non-binary folks or leave them out, which continues to feed to that erasure of two-spirit, queer, and trans folks and trans Indigenous folks. So current work. So I like to always just speak about some of the current work going on. So I don't want it to really be like we do have a lot of work to do, but there is also a lot of beautiful work going on. There is a huge resurgence of two-spirit folks going on, and we need to be supported and created, and I think are supported and given space back. And I think this is extremely important when we're talking about doing two-spirit specific research for folks who are on the call that are interested or wanting to do or are actively doing two-spirit specific research, making sure that we're looped in from the start, that we are not an afterthought, that we are not just a reviewer who is given an extremely tight deadline to review documents to deem them as two-spirit safe, so that we are included and incorporated throughout data collection, throughout the conceptual formation of your research questions and the current state of research. I'll speak about the meet the methods right now, or in a moment, and then the protective factor language is the piece about my specific area of study, but I'll get into that in a moment. So meet the method. So this is a perfect example of a way that we can collect data specifically, and I spoke to this a little bit about the conceptual understanding of two-spirit people, that for a long time, we've specifically added two-spirit to gender identity or two-spirit to sexual orientation. And then we also would have an ethnicity questions about somebody's indigeneity. And through doing data collection this way, we set ourselves up for a huge inaccurate number, because a number of folks, and I don't blame them, will pick two-spirit who aren't Indigenous, who don't fit within that spectrum of indigeneity, and will pick the term because it is a beautiful, amazing concept, and that results in inaccurate data collection. But also, it again limits it to the specific identifiers that it's being labeled under, so specifically a sexual orientation or a gender identity. And though it's not specifically one of those things, it is included in those things. So this is a slide that Harlan and I like to share, where we did do a study in 2014 where it was written this way, and found that almost 62% of the respondents who identified as two-spirit within the realms of gender identity or sexual identity weren't Indigenous. So it's just reinforces that fact that by including it in these realms of gender expression or gender identity, gender and sexual identity, we're actually setting ourselves up to have inaccurate data collection. And through this way, which I would strongly recommend, because the two-spirit concept is so deeply rooted in indigeneity, we're able to limit folks outside of those realms. So through the process of including it under ethnicity, so we would do it including indigeneity, folks who First Nations, Métis, or Inuit folks, and then that two-spirit concept will come into there. So it's not limited to somebody's sexual orientation or somebody's gender expression, but it is included in our indigeneity. So I'm able to identify within the gender that I feel connected to, as well as within the sexual orientation that I feel connected to, as well as identify as Indigenous and two-spirit. So it allows us to collect a larger picture, or a bigger picture for two-spirit people that includes our many intersecting identities. This is also, I'm happy to share it after. It's called Meet the Methods, the who and what of two-spirit that Harlan Pruden and Travis Alway was able to create and share. Another conversation that I like to just quickly have, because I know that we're getting close to time, is about language. So there's many conversations going on in our realms of healthcare and in research about language, and does language really matter? And I always need to reinforce that it does. To some folks, a pronoun may seem like just a word, but to other folks, a pronoun is a life-saving measure. And I think we really need to start to identify and validate that the perspectives that language matters deeply. A lot of times now we're really shifting to more of additive language. So we are saying women and other people who give birth. And I like to challenge some of that perspective as what are we still centering and what are we still normalizing when we're using additive language? Are we able just to say folks who give birth or birthers instead? Because when we use additive language, we are still centering on a societal binary or societal norm and taking away from or labeling everybody else as other or as abnormal or as a one-off. And that's a perspective that I'm hoping that we're able to start to challenge and reflect on today. Because as I said earlier, what is our goal? It's to create a space for all folks to be able to identify. So if we create an avenue where majority of the folks identify as women within birth work, that's great. But we also have that avenue for folks to not identify within that realm or within that gender expression. And I think that's an extremely important piece for us to be able to provide is an avenue for all folks to identify, regardless of who the majority of the population is that you're serving, and normalizing that piece. And self-identification does matter. I think in the work that we're doing, sorry, my phone's ringing. In the work that we're doing, I think it's extremely important for us to be able to self-identify who we are and where we're from in our research, in our academia, or in our academic articles and papers and publishings. I got a lot of pushback when I was doing my master's about the paragraph of situating myself and the many backpacks I wear as a Two-Spirit person living in a world working in Two-Spirit health, studying Two-Spirit health. And I think it was extremely important for that contextual paragraph to be included, but folks outside of my realms thought it was a waste of space. But I directly challenge that as that context matters. The reason I'm called to this work matters. And that's what I strongly recommend folks including that identification in all the articles or the pieces, the work that they're doing. So the last piece that I will quickly just run through is hopefully trying to wrap it all together through my own work and my own master's findings is again, how language matters and how historically we focused on if Two-Spirit people were included, what it looked like. So for a long time, and we've definitely started to shift this risk factor language, but for a long time, Two-Spirit folks, Two-Spirit queer and trans Indigenous folks were typically included in a sentence about risk factors. And it always would focus on the risk factors, but centering on my indigeneity or my Two-Spirit understanding or my Two-Spirit identity or my queerness. So it was always focusing on these factors of myself instead of which were the actual risk factors: racism, homophobia, discrimination. So for a long time, we've been developing questions that will center on my indigeneity, my queerness being the risk factor, being the problem. And now my dog's barking. So sorry. The struggles of being a home with two dogs. So really focusing on that my indigeneity is a risk instead of racism or discrimination or societal influence. So really realizing that for a long time, majority of my master's research, the first sentences of the articles I would read would speak to how I'm likely to die. The first sentence will tell me the statistical data that's telling me when or how I'm likely going to die as a Two-Spirit queer Métis person, as well as that me being me is a risk factor, versus now challenging some of that restrictive or risk factor language and looking at how my indigeneity, my queerness, my Two-Spirit conceptual understanding are protective factors for me, and how that actually has allowed me to survive and thrive in the current state of society that is telling me that I am abnormal or that I am wrong, and creating documentation and articles that speak to that thriving versus the historical risk factor documents that spoke to the deficits. And that also led to the erasure, stigma, and shaming of Two-Spirit queer and trans Indigenous folks. So really looking at that narrative, how risk factor may not seem that important or not that big of a deal to some folks, but the stigma and shame that follows with that terminology is everlasting. And still we see it today in documentation and research listing indigeneity as a risk factor instead of, like I said, the actual cause: racism, homophobia, discrimination. So I'm just aware of time at this point. I'm happy to stop there, Brittany, and pass it back for some questions or discussions, because I know I covered many things, and I'm very happy to dive into some conversations with folks in the room.